We began with ties between the United States and Canada, which have now reached a new low.
Trade relations between the U.S. and Canada have been experiencing an unprecedented crisis in recent months. The Washington authorities have just announced the introduction of new tariffs that could significantly complicate life for Canadian manufacturers. And although the parties previously seemed to be moving towards a compromise, the situation has changed dramatically in recent days. The U.S. president said live on air that he would not meet with the Canadian Prime Minister at the upcoming international summit, which sparked a flurry of discussion in the global media. The reason? The same dispute over tariffs that has dragged on for several months and political advertising that has caused a storm of discontent. What was the turning point in these relations?
On Monday, President Donald Trump said he would not meet with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney for a while, following Washington's decision to increase tariffs on Canadian goods by an additional 10%.
Why did the seemingly strong trade ties between the two countries suddenly deteriorate so sharply? This conflict is about much more than just numbers on paper. It concerns the economy, politics, and even the personal ambitions of world leaders. These tariffs are expected to affect not only exports, but also the financial situation of entire industries in Canada. How will Canadian companies react to this, and what steps will Washington take in response? And so, despite all the efforts of the Canadian side, it has proved incredibly difficult to resume dialogue.
When asked by reporters aboard Air Force One whether he would actually meet with the Canadian leader during the upcoming Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, the president replied that he had no plans to do so. President Trump's comments come after the administration recently halted.
What is at the root of this instability, and why will Canada have to look for new allies to stay afloat in the face of American pressure? And how important is it in such a situation to use international summits to maintain relations with neighbors? All of this becomes an important part of the broader geopolitical context that will determine the future of both countries in the coming years. Will a compromise be possible, or are we in for an even tougher clash of interests? What other unexpected twists and turns might this story take? And most importantly, how will this affect ordinary citizens whose businesses and jobs depend on foreign trade? We'll talk about all this and more in today's episode. Stay tuned, because the most interesting part is just beginning.
The president ended bilateral discussions with Canada shortly after that, saying the ad misused Reagan's words. Now, President Trump's latest remarks also come after Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney on Monday said he remains open to dialogue with Washington. And speaking on the sidelines of the regional summit in Malaysia, Carney told reporters he was ready to resume talks and described the suspension of negotiations as unexpected.
Relations between the U.S. and Canada, which have seemed stable and friendly for the past few decades, are undergoing a real crisis that could have a major impact on the economies of both countries. The United States has decided to significantly increase tariffs on Canadian goods, which immediately sparked a reaction in Canada and abroad. The day after the announcement, the U.S. president said he had no plans to meet with the Canadian Prime Minister in the near future, which came as a shock to many experts and politicians. With this gesture, Trump made it clear that the trade situation had reached an impasse and that it might take much longer to restore normal relations. Against the backdrop of this decision, the question of what led to such a sharp deterioration in relations between the two countries, which until recently had been close trading partners, became particularly acute. The problem began with the increase in tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, which, according to economists, has already led to billions of dollars in losses for Canadian manufacturers.
The president knows that I'm available to speak to the president, as I always would be, as you would expect. As president of the United States, so of course, make myself available and make myself available for other world leaders as they wish to. We will both be in APEC. Canada's a member of APEC. We're going to be there, very much so.
Despite attempts to resolve the conflict through diplomatic means, the situation only worsened. This was due not only to economic measures, but also to political differences, especially in the context of how to respond to domestic advertising using Ronald Reagan, who at one time opposed high tariffs, as a symbol. The advertisement, which used the former U.S. president's speech, provoked a fierce reaction in Washington. Many perceived it as a political provocation that not only distorted Reagan's words, but also openly criticized the current administration. In response, the Trump administration decided to suspend negotiations with Canada, adding even more tension to an already complicated relationship. U.S. officials said the ad was fake, and that using Reagan's image without permission was an insult to the memory of a great leader. As a result of these accusations, negotiations were frozen, and Trump announced that he would not be meeting with the Canadian Prime Minister in the coming months. This position was particularly harsh, given that the leaders of the two countries had previously planned to meet at an important summit. What was the reason for such a drastic step? Tariffs were not the only factor at the heart of this conflict. It was also related to how Washington perceived the whole conflict, which seemed to be part of a broader political game. Indeed, the Canadian Prime Minister tried to conduct negotiations privately, assuring that he was ready to compromise.
These measures have had a notable impact on Canadian manufacturers, particularly in Ontario, where a significant share of goods are exported to the U.S. Roughly 3/4 of Canada's total exports go to the United States, leaving its economy exposed to an escalation in trade restrictions.
But even his efforts were deemed insufficient to prevent the situation from deteriorating further. Trump, for his part, claimed that the Canadians were not responding clearly enough to the tough measures and insisted that the country must confirm its readiness for serious negotiations. However, tariffs were not the only source of tension. As trade negotiations with Canada gradually reached an impasse, there were increasingly loud calls around the world for Canada to seek other ways to develop its trade relations. This is because the Canadian economy is heavily dependent on exports, especially to the U.S., and any trade barriers, including tariffs, can have a devastating impact on manufacturing industries.
He did confirm that he would meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping at the upcoming APEC summit in South Korea.
More and more Canadian politicians began to talk about the need to diversify foreign trade and seek new partnerships in the global market in order to reduce dependence on a single country. However, this has not been as easy as it might seem at first glance. Canada now faces a huge problem. Almost 3/4 of all Canadian production is exported to the U.S. This leaves Canada vulnerable to Washington's economic and political decisions. After the introduction of new tariffs, Canadian companies began to suffer heavy losses, which led to a sharp reduction in jobs in those industries that were focused on exports to the U.S. Businesses in Ontario, where exports to the U.S. account for a significant part of economic activity, were particularly affected. In response, many local political leaders began calling for the search for alternative markets and trade diversification. As the tariff situation continued to escalate, the Canadian government began taking steps to improve trade relations with other countries. For example, negotiations with the European Union and Asia have recently intensified. Canadian diplomats began actively seeking new opportunities to expand foreign trade, and to this end, the Canadian Prime Minister participated in several international forums and meetings with world leaders.
Shifted the tone of engagement between the two governments. For now, trade relations between Washington and Ottawa remain uncertain, with tariff disputes and political differences continuing to shape the conversation. How both governments navigate these issues will in fact shape the economic outlook for both countries as the tariffs in fact continue.
As part of these efforts, the possible conclusion of new agreements was announced, which would allow Canada to reduce its dependence on the American market and compensate for possible losses from trade restrictions. However, all this only highlights how strongly the U.S. has influenced its neighbor's economy and how important good relations with America are for Canada. The uncertainty caused by trade wars and political disagreements has put Canadian businesses at high risk. Too much depends on how this trade war will develop and when, if ever, the parties will be able to reach a compromise. For now, both countries are on the brink of a possible economic crisis, and the question of how these relations will develop in the future remains open. The scandal caused by political advertising continues to leave a serious mark on relations between the U.S. and Canada. The ad, which used archival recordings of a speech by a former U.S. president, immediately attracted the attention of the global community and became a stumbling block in trade negotiations between the two countries. A speech by Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, in which he condemned high import tariffs, was used in the context of an advertisement created by one of the Canadian provinces.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
This commercial turned out to be not only a political statement, but also, according to the Trump administration, a direct challenge to U.S. policy. Reagan's speech on the consequences of high tariffs was taken out of context, and its use in advertising, according to analysts, was a way for Canada to show its opposition to Trump's policies. However, from the U.S. administration's point of view, this was not just a political gesture. They perceived this move as a blatant attempt to manipulate public opinion. After watching the video, the U.S. president said it was nothing more than fake news and added that if Reagan were alive, he would certainly not support such measures.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
This statement caused an uproar in Canadian circles as it called into question not only the legality of the advertisement, but also Canada's dignity as an independent participant in global trade processes. This incident played an important role in the further deterioration of relations between the two countries. One of the retaliatory measures was the suspension of trade negotiations with Canada. The U.S. administration announced this decision a few days after the advertisement received widespread publicity. It is noteworthy that American diplomats cited political instability within Canada as the reason for suspending negotiations rather than economic reasons. They emphasized that any move that creates such political tension is unlikely to contribute to the stabilization of trade relations. However, it became clear to many that it was this advertisement that prompted Washington to suspend negotiations, despite the progress that had been made on a number of economic issues, such as discussions on steel and aluminum tariffs and cooperation in the energy sector. The Canadian Prime Minister's response to this situation was no less striking.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
Mark Carney, despite personal differences, said that Canada is open to dialogue and ready to continue negotiations despite the current situation. And this statement was made against the backdrop of growing tension in the country and pressure on the government. The Canadian side claimed that the advertisement had no political motive behind it, but was merely an attempt to draw public attention to the issue of high tariffs. However, this explanation did not satisfy the Trump administration. Carney also noted that he had no intention of offending the U.S. and that his country would always be ready to negotiate, even if serious political obstacles had to be overcome. Carney's statement about his willingness to resume negotiations was made during his participation in a regional summit in Malaysia.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began at the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
There he noted that the situation with trade negotiations with the U.S. came as a complete surprise to him. He said that both countries, the U.S. and Canada, will inevitably face the consequences of trade wars. And these consequences will affect not only the economy, but also political relations in the long term. Carney also stressed that the Canadian government continues to seek ways to strengthen economic ties with other countries and is stepping up efforts to develop partnerships on the international stage in order to reduce dependence on the U.S. market. It is worth noting that Carney has not actually negotiated with Trump since the U.S. president suspended trade talks over advertising. This also highlights the seriousness of the situation in which the Canadian Prime Minister found himself. Although Canada needed to rebuild economic ties with the U.S., the political situation in the country and external economic challenges required efforts not only at the diplomatic level, but also at the level of domestic policy. Many experts in Canada expressed concern that the long absence of official negotiations with the U.S. leadership could lead to additional economic sanctions and a deterioration in the investment climate.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
At the same time, the situation began to take a new turn against the backdrop of international efforts to improve trade relations. Despite the crisis with the U.S., Carney announced his intention to meet with the Chinese leader within the framework of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, where he probably intended to discuss global economic issues, including prospects for trade with China. This was seen as an attempt by the Canadian government to find new ways to expand foreign trade, reducing its dependence on the U.S. It is noteworthy that the meeting with the Chinese leader was also seen as a signal to China of Canada's readiness to further strengthen economic ties. However, many analysts warn that all these efforts may prove insufficient if no solution is found to the main problem, restoring mutual understanding with the U.S. Economists warn that in the context of the growing crisis and the introduction of tariffs on Canadian goods, the country needs not only to strengthen ties with China, but also to seek new solutions to resolve disputes with the U.S. How this conflict is resolved will determine not only Canada's economic well-being, but also the future of its trade relations on the international stage. This in turn raises the question of what will happen to the American side if the tension continues.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
A trade war with Canada could have far-reaching consequences, and not only for the Canadian economy. Some experts believe that such a confrontation could provoke retaliatory measures from other countries, leading to global economic instability. It is important to note that even if negotiations resume, they are likely to take place under intense pressure and a great deal of uncertainty, which will only exacerbate the consequences of this trade war for both countries. The tariff measures introduced by the U.S. administration have begun to have an increasingly serious impact on the Canadian economy. Manufacturing companies focused on exports to the U.S. are particularly hard hit. Canada is known to be the U.S.'s largest trading partner, and a significant portion of Canadian exports go to this country. According to some data, approximately 73% of Canadian products, from automobiles to agricultural goods, end up on the U.S. market. And now that the United States has decided to raise tariffs on Canadian goods, the situation for Canadian companies has become extremely tense. Immediately after the introduction of new tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, a real economic crisis broke out in Canada.
Well, when U.S. officials talk, we need to make sure that we listen.
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens. But it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
According to unofficial data, the damage to the Canadian economy from the new measures is estimated at tens of billions of dollars. Many large manufacturers, especially in Ontario and Quebec, have begun to report reductions in production. Canadian economists warn that if the situation does not change, it could lead to the loss of thousands of jobs. The main industries affected by the tariff increases include automotive manufacturing, metallurgy, and agriculture. All of these sectors are highly dependent on the U.S. market, and now they are under threat. One of the most striking examples has been the impact on the automotive industry, which is a vital part of the Canadian economy. After the new tariffs were introduced, Canadian automakers reported that their products had become significantly less competitive in the U.S. market. In response, several large automotive companies began to move their production facilities from Canada to other countries where tariffs on their goods are not as high. This has led to job losses, and according to some estimates, the Canadian automotive industry could lose up to 20,000 jobs in the coming months.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Against this backdrop, pressure is mounting on the Canadian government to find ways to compensate for the losses. The country's political leaders are beginning to express concern about growing social discontent, which could lead to an internal political crisis. The economic difficulties caused by tariffs are exacerbated by rising prices for imported goods. Tariffs on steel and aluminum have affected not only domestic companies, but also consumers, who now have to pay more for goods, such as cars and household appliances. The Canadian government continues to negotiate with other countries in an attempt to find alternative markets for Canadian exports. However, the success of these efforts is not yet clear. There's active discussion in Canada about deepening economic ties with the European Union, which would significantly reduce dependence on the U.S. This would undoubtedly be an important step that could change Canada's economic landscape, but it would require time and effort at the diplomatic level.
Really build on that relationship, and I think that's why the outcome this week was a positive one. Well, we know that no deal has been struck. We know that negotiations are going ahead in the right direction.
Despite this, many economists argue that Canada needs to invest more in new industries, such as high technology, to diversify its economy and reduce its dependence on traditional export goods. But it is not only the economy that is under threat. Domestic political risks associated with trade disputes are also becoming increasingly significant. Be that as it may, Canada will have to find a way to withstand internal pressure, which is only growing stronger by the day. Growing discontent within the country and the external economic crisis could have serious consequences for political stability in Canada. Whatever happens, the government faces a difficult road ahead and must now be prepared for new challenges. At the same time, it should not be forgotten that economic measures such as tariffs not only hinder trade development, but also have serious political consequences for both countries. The tariff situation also leads to global instability in the world economy. The U.S. and Canada, as the two largest economies in North America,
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States. and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures
Play an important role in global financial flows, and any changes in their trade relations can affect other countries. For example, South American countries, which have traditionally focused on trade with Canada and the U.S., have already begun to express concern as they watch the situation unfold. The possible expansion of tariff measures, as well as the introduction of new trade restrictions between the U.S. and Canada, could lead to price increases for many goods around the world. Given this, uncertainty in trade relations between the U.S. and Canada risks creating a chain reaction that will affect not only North America, but also other regions. This is especially true for developing countries whose economies depend on imports from major world powers. Meanwhile, China, which is actively developing economic ties with Canada, could become one of the main beneficiaries if the trade war between the U.S. and Canada continues. Experts are already warning that an increase in China's presence in the Canadian market could change not only the dynamics of Canada's foreign trade, but also the political ties between the countries.